Now on Radio 4, Any Questions, chaired by Jonathan Dimbleby.
Welcome to Haverhill, or Haverhill as it's often called, in Suffolk, one of the new towns that was developed more than half a century ago around a market town which dates back to the 11th century. Its purpose then to resettle communities that were devastated by the bombing of the Second World War. It has now obviously moved on a long way from there, but it still has its fair share of social problems. The Samuel Ward Academy, our host for this programme, has made a priority of tackling low self-esteem among its students by introducing a strong set of values, improving outcomes that beat the national average, concentrating on sport and the arts, and increasing the number of those who go to university. As a result, it has an outstanding from Ofsted. On our panel, Steve Webb is a Liberal Democrat member of the government who works as the minister responsible for pensions in Ian Duncan Smith's department. Caroline Flint is the Shadow Secretary for Energy and Climate Change, who's committed her party to abolishing Ofgem for, I quote, failing to get tough with the energy giants. Mark Reckless is a Libertarian on the right of the Conservative Party, a member of the Home Affairs Select Committee and the inspiration behind the so-called, it would be, wouldn't it, reckless amendment which embarrassed his party leader by demanding cuts in the EU budget. The Revd Canon Rosie Harper is the parish priest of Great Missenden in Buckinghamshire, a member of the Church Synod. She said before the vote that to block women from becoming bishops would be, I quote, the act of a dying church. Our panel. Our first question, please.
Gary Stroud. With senior EU members this evening criticising the PM for his insistence on cuts, should he have taken a different approach?
The Prime Minister said that what was on offer was not good enough, but a deal he thought was still doable. Other leaders have said various things, but all of them still seem to be saying that despite important differences of opinion and all the rest of it, there was still potential, to quote Mrs Merkel, potential for an agreement. Mark Reckless.
Well, I thought what was striking was the amount of support David Cameron had from other EU countries, from Germany, from Holland, many of the Scandinavian countries. And we were told when we had my amendment 3 weeks ago that it was unrealistic to push for a cut. But actually several countries were pushing for a cut. And when I had the Prime Minister earlier, I felt he spoke for the whole country. And in particular, when he was referring to the civil servants in the EU, many of whom, in effect, earn more than he does, who have their special tax rate, they pay hardly any tax, they have huge pensions for very little contribution, they get a £20,000 expat allowance even if they're permanently in Belgium. Every child they have, they get another £300 tax-free every month. And if you take that all into account, perhaps thousands of those civil servants are actually taking home more than our Prime Minister. So to ask for some cut in the budget, as Parliament did 3 weeks ago, is, I just think, reasonable.
But the civil servants pay. However right you may feel he is about that, the civil servants' pay in the Commission is absolutely tiny as a total proportion of the budget. You're not going to get a cut in the budget, even if you fired all the civil servants, are you?
Well, overall, the amount of administration is around 60 billion euros, and I think that the Prime Minister was very sensibly proposing what I thought was a very modest 10% reduction in that. And I think it does add up to real money. And
will you still feel that he has failed if he doesn't get absolute real-term cuts as opposed to the freeze that he's after?
Well, I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in the EU budget process, and what the Prime Minister has been pushing for was an inflation increase from the 2011 payments. What I wanted to see is something which is clear to the ordinary taxpayer as a reduction, at least some reduction, in the EU budget. And I really hope the Prime Minister can deliver that, because he will be supported by Parliament and by the whole of this country. And I just think we have to say enough is enough in terms of the waste and, frankly, corruption in EU spending. Steve
Webb, as a government minister, he presumably thought that Mr Reckless's amendment was indeed reckless. Do you think the Prime Minister, you're now being recklessly loyal, Mr Reckless?
I guess there's a difference between the ideal and the real. All of us would say there is EU spending which is wasteful. For me, one of the scandals is having a Parliament that meets 3 weeks in one place and 1 week in another. And that has been talked about, and hands have been wrung about it for a long time, and nothing is ever done. And I would like to suggest, with my personal hat on at this juncture, that I'd like to see MEPs boycotting the week in Strasbourg until it stops, because it's a nonsense. That's what I'd like to see. Now, in terms of the budget, clearly, ideally, Britain's had to cut back on things. You know, I'm in the Department of Work and Pensions. We've had to cut back on some very difficult things. Of course, the EU should be cutting back on wasteful spending. It should be focusing on what it's best at, on trying to get jobs, on tackling climate change and so on. But you go into a negotiation of 27, more than half of whom are net beneficiaries. So you are never going to come away with a cut. And the challenge really is, do you go in, get a good headline on the tabloids, knowing perfectly well you've not got a chance? And what we've seen tonight is the negotiations have got nowhere, even going in, trying to get a real terms free. So going for a cut would have been a great headline, but would have been utterly fatuous.
Quick response on that, Mark?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister has, along actually with a number of other countries, been pushing for a cut. And when I hear that, well, there's no way you can get that because most countries are net beneficiaries, the budget's always got to go up, there's nothing we can do about it. Frankly, people then ask, I mean, why are we part of an organisation where the budget can only go up? And I think what EU leaders have to see, and I think why the position's changed of some of these countries who have been arguing for a cut, is if we don't get at least some reduction, then I think the opinion in this country is going to become even stronger that we would be better off as an independent country, trading with Europe. But governing ourselves. So if they do want any money from the UK, then I think they have to come to some sort of deal, because otherwise we're going to be outside and they're not going to be getting anything from us.
Caroline Flint, you politically did an extraordinary U-turn, your party, in getting into bed, as it were, politically, with Mark Reckless's amendment, which was regarded by many as a deeply populist and cynical move. Are you now proud of what the Prime Minister has so far achieved?
Well, actually, Mark's amendment came some months after we voted in July earlier this year for a real terms cut in the budget. So, actually, we'd already got form on that, if you like, because we do feel, and I'm pro-European, and where I disagree with Mark is I actually think being outside the EU looking in won't do us any good at all. 60% of our trade is linked to this single market. Huge amount of investment. But having said that, I also believe that in order to us make sure, as Ed Miliband said, we don't drift to the exit, we need to look at how we reform the European Union. And part of that is, given where we are today, with every single one of the member states having to look at how they make cuts in their own national budgets, as we are, then it's only fair to ask the EU to do the same. And within that, also then look at the reforms you can make. And I'm proud to say and pleased to say that our Labour MEPs have not only voted against a rise in the budget, they also voted for a cut of £1 billion in the Common Agricultural Policy too.
Are you proud of how the Prime Minister is doing at the moment?
Well, I think the problem is for David Cameron is that you cannot, even if you go a day early, which I think he took an RAF flight to do so, you know, the sort of negotiation that goes on for these events has to happen, you know, months and years in advance. And since he's been Prime Minister, he has taken his party out of the mainstream grouping of his sister parties in Europe, so there's no chance to discuss these issues there. He has, you know, walked out of meetings, threatened the veto, and this doesn't really allow him, I think, to credibly argue his corner. I think the very disappointing thing about today's meeting, it sounds like they met for less than 2 hours, which is probably just enough time for everyone to go around the table and introduce themselves, and it has collapsed. And, you know, these are very serious issues. And as I said, you know, it is about making sure that we have a European Union that can deliver, I think, very positive aspects for us as citizens, but also for our economy going forward. But there has to be change.
I'll bring you back in a moment, Mark Reckless. But Rosie Harper.
I feel there are some deeper things going on in this whole conversation. I think we're thinking about the earth really moving under Europe's feet. It used to be a very wealthy area, and it was a matter of distributing that wealth evenly throughout a whole load of different countries. And now we're in a period when it's austerity Europe, and I think we're bound to share that pain. Some of that, I think, will involve making cuts, but I'm very worried about what could be seen as a drift towards more nationalism and more patriotism. In 2 years' time, we're commemorating the beginning of World War I, and that was marked most strikingly by a massive rise in nationalism. One of the great saints, really, of the Anglican Church was Edith Cavell, and she said, "Good as patriotism is, it is not enough." And I think to hold together the dream that brought Europe together in the first place is going to be essential as the shifting plates happen and there's danger of fracture.
Do you feel then that people who hold the view that Mark Reckless does, that we might well be better outside it, and if the European Union breaks up, it's not the end of the world, are steering or would steer this nation into a path of towards the abyss?
Actually, I think that's quite a frightening idea. I think we've begun to develop a sense of mutual accountability, and to lose that would be a very risky thing.
I think the problem... The problem in Europe at the moment is the EU, and in particular the euro, is setting country against country. And if you look at what's happening in Athens and how they're referring to Germany, despite Germany actually putting in all this money, I think it's absolutely terrible to see that level of dissension and actually mutual hatred developing within the European Union. And to correct Caroline, she said 60% of our trade goes to the single market. I mean, that is just wrong. It is less than half. It's a declining portion of our trade. And we've had, I think, 25 of these summits since David Cameron's been Prime Minister. Actually, I think our Prime Minister would be much better spending his time, as he has a lot, visiting the key emerging market economies, leading trade delegations, seeing these huge increases actually we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years in our exports outside the EU. So we link in with those emerging markets, the growing parts of the world, rather than just tying ourselves to one declining continent.
Canon Harper.
Can I just challenge Mark's statistics? I've got them in front of me here. Just in the 3 years between 2008 and 2011, our trade with Europe rose from 316 billion to 360 billion. That's a rise of 10% per year. And I think where else would you have the opportunity of making those sorts of gains?
And since 2011, it has fallen sharply. I think down about 12% in the last 6 months. Whereas our exports to China, to Brazil, to Russia are up between 20 and 80%.
Your option is to basically leave the European Union, and what you want to do is have your cake and eat it, which is you think you're going to get all these benefits looking from the outside in, but you will have no influence. We will have no influence over country about how this market will develop and the other things that Rosie's talked about in terms of our common security. And the truth is countries like Norway, because I think you've cited that, they're not part of the European Union, but do you know what? They have to abide by most of the rules of us, and they have no influence on it if they want to trade with Europe.
Briefly, because we must move on.
The example I cite is actually Switzerland, which, as you put it, does have its cake and eat it. It's outside the EU. It's actually outside the single market and making its own regulations about its own domestic economy that I think so important. It exports far more to the EU per head than we do.
Do you think Switzerland, because of its very special character, is a comparable economy to the British economy?
I think we would probably get a better deal, and one that is more attuned to our needs as a country. And I think actually the thing we could most do is not cart from the sidelines, not tell the EU they've got to...
There's a difference between sort of countries, for example, who've never wanted to be part of the European Union. You really think if we decide to walk away that somehow the European Union is going to say, oh, you know what, we'll give you a really good deal?
I do.
I don't think so.
I do, because the other countries in the EU don't want us stopping what they want to do. If they want a political union, if they want a higher budget, if they want a more and more unified Europe, then I think we should let them have that. We should be friendly with them. We should support that from outside rather than getting in their way and stopping them doing what they want.
And this is the problem for David Cameron in his negotiations, because they know there's people like Mark who really aren't interested in Europe at all.
Insofar as one, if you were listening at home, you'd be hearing quite a lot of applause for both sides of this argument, and of course can't see and can't measure what it relates to in terms of individual views. But just very crudely, who finds themselves in sympathy with what Mark Reckless is saying? Would you put your hands up? Who finds themselves in sympathy with what we've just heard Caroline Flint saying? Would you put your hands up? Well, I would say in this audience, and I'll be open to correction, it's about 60-40 or maybe 70-30 in favour of Caroline Flint's view at the moment. Mark Reckless wants to oppose that, I know. You'll have to take a snapshot photograph. We'll try and arrange it for you afterwards. A reminder of the any answers number for this or any of the other issues that we're discussing. It's 03700 100 444. The lines incidentally open at 12:30 after the Saturday or before the Saturday broadcast of this programme. And Anita Anand will be there to take your calls and to deal with your emails as well, any.answers@bbc.co.uk. And do tweet us using the hashtag BBCAQ. Can we go to our next?
Thank you. Ian Jacobs. Is it right that the Church should retain its exemption from equalities legislation following this week's vote to block women becoming bishops?
Steve Webb. You are one, as I said, I think you are one of the notable Christians. There's a group of you, and they're Christians in Parliament.
There is, and I guess I should declare an interest because my wife is a priest in the Church of England. So I speak as a potential bishop's husband. We've joked on occasion which one of us would get to the House of Lords first, actually.
Won't you have abolished it by then?
Well, not at this rate. I have to say, and we were chatting to Rosie beforehand, who was at the Synod and who will have felt it much more intensely than I did. Just the whole week broke my heart, frankly. As a member of the Church of England, I want my church to be talking about the things that really matter, about the reason why it's there, about caring for people, about loving people, about being, spreading the gospel. And what does my church spend all its time talking about? It talks about whether women can be bishops, about homosexuality, and I just want us to get through all of this as rapidly as possible. I'm not convinced, and I hesitate to try and actually answer your specific question, but I suppose I should. I'm not sure that Parliament trying to turn the screws at this point really does it for me, because I think and I hope and I believe that the Church will quickly come to its senses. I think the reaction to this week's been very powerful. I think even those who've been opposed will have been pretty struck by the overwhelming view that we've just got to get on with this. It's a nonsense that women, not because women want to lord it over anybody, but just because the message of the gospel is that everybody is equal in God's sight.
Canon Harper, I quoted you at the beginning of this programme that a vote against a blocking vote of this kind would be the vote of a dying church. Do you still feel that?
Yes, I feel that the church has been humiliated and shamed by this vote. I think that obviously it's clearly not about ambitious women wanting to be bishops. It's about people being able to belong to a church which has justice and equality right at its heart. And if it doesn't get this one right, how can it speak about other issues around the world? It undermines its authority, and it gives the impression to our country that people in the church actually have lower ethical standards than they do. If I speak to my children, they have very good, strong core values about treating people equally. It's a no-brainer to them that a woman has the same right to a job depending on their skills, not depending on their gender. They are entirely clear about homosexuals having the same rights as everyone else in all aspects of society. And then they look at the church and they think, what are these standards that they're talking about? Why don't they believe as passionately as I do about, as you were rightly saying, the core of the gospel?
How do you respond to those in your church who are devoutly Christian and say they just happen to believe that it's inappropriate for a woman to become a bishop? That's part of their profound belief, and go on to say, and one of the great things about the Church of England is that you respect minorities to the point where you have a blocking mechanism. You have to have a very clear 65% majority before you change course, because they're the people who are, in your view, humiliating your church.
Yes. Listen, history is scattered with train crashes caused by people who profoundly believed in what they were doing. The fact that you profoundly believe in it doesn't make it right.
Can I add one more thing? I read one of your colleagues who shares your view, saying that a number of those who had got themselves voted into the Synod, saying that they approved of women being in the ministry, were either not telling the truth or wanted that to be ministry as priests like you are, but not as bishops. Is that true? Was there a sort of infiltration, a sort of fifth column, in your judgment?
I don't think that's the sort of thing I would dream of saying on public radio.
Well, you could. If you tweet it quickly, we can pick it up and.
No, listen, the really bizarre thing about I was sitting there in General Synod, I made my speech, I sat there for 7 hours, and the entire day was about people arguing about the strength of legislation there should be to protect themselves from me. Now, in what way is that a Christian concept? I can't understand that. But it was very hard to sit there and listen to being discriminated against at that extent.
And to go back to Ian Jacobs' question, would you want the exclusion that applies at the moment to the Church from the equalities legislation to be removed from the Church?
Actually, personally, yes, I would. I don't see why the Church should have the option to exclude people when people in society at large don't have that option and should not have that option.
Mark Reckless.
My own church, the Catholic Church, has a very, very clear policy, and I wouldn't wish to take on the Pope on this issue or really any other. And I think that there's an issue here specifically about the Church of England because it's the established church, and also because there are bishops, and currently all male bishops by requirement, in the House of Lords. I would feel very concerned about saying to religions generally, this is how the state says you must practice your religion, even on this particular issue. But the Church of England, the issue I really feel for the Church on is the strength of opinion within the Church that there should be women bishops. Almost all the bishops, a very large majority of the priests, and then in the laity, even virtually 2/3 in that House as well. So you're stuck with this position where really quite a small minority is driving the policy, and everyone else is upset about it, and the Church is going to be going on about this issue for however many more years, rather than focusing on its mission. That's what saddens me.
Are you nonetheless with Steve on this, that the Parliament should not interfere to alter legislation?
On balance, yes, that's my instinct, but I would like to listen to those MPs who are putting forward contrary arguments.
Caroline Flint.
It's an interesting point, isn't it, about the legislation? And just whispering to Rosie here, of course, you know, one of the aspects of the Church of England, it is the established church, and therefore has a role and a presence in our country that is, you know, has a different order of engagement with our parliamentary procedures. And of course, the Queen herself is the defender of the faith. And it's quite weird, isn't it, that you have people like Rosie as a priest, a vicar in the church, and then you have the Queen as the head of the church, but that at a bishop level, women can't be part of that. That's a bit weird. That's a bit like... That's a bit like saying you can be a woman MP, but you can't be a woman Prime Minister. Well, that's not happening. But look, the equalities legislation clearly does have relevance to faiths in our country, and not just the Church of England, because obviously in terms of services that a number of different faiths provide, in terms of charitable work, educational services, social services, they have to apply with that legislation. I have to say,
do you have a faith yourself?
I was brought up C of E, so that's what that was what I was baptised in, and went to a church school. But I sort of think at the moment I'd like to hear a bit more debate about it, because I think when it comes to the organisation of a church and its structures, then somehow just saying we will apply this legislation, I'm not sure how much that will help the internal debate that needs to happen. But having said that, you know, we are now, you know, some days after the decision's been made. I think both probably in the church and inside Parliament there is comment and debate about what should happen next, and let's hope that what happens next is that there's an early resolution of what seems to me, from what I've heard, a majority of people in the Church of England actually wanting this change to happen.
Give you that number once more for any answers. 03700 100 444. We'll go to our next.
Peter Thomas. In view of the fact that energy generation infrastructure has a lifetime in excess of 30 years, does the lack of clarity on future CO2 emissions mean that the energy bill has still failed to give investors the lead they require?
The outline of the energy bill has been just announced. The bill comes before the House next week. Gas, nuclear, offshore wind, these are all the issues that you're concerned about, and the extent to which we have targets for reducing carbon emissions precisely in the flow up until 2050. Is that your...
Indeed.
Caroline Flint.
Yes, I think it does. I think it's a mistake that the government have indicated today that when the energy bill is published next week, there will not be a target to reduce carbon in the power sector by 2030, because I find it difficult to see, unless we have that target, a clear target, how we will give the certainty to investors, because 10 years is a blink of an eye when it comes to energy infrastructure, and with the present arrangements by the government in terms of what they're setting out today, we'll only go up to 2020. But also, we won't really begin to really tackle what is the longer term target of 2050 in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And it's with regret that the government have chosen this route. They obviously had differences of opinion, and they've really ended up with a fudge. And it's important because we do need to reduce our emissions, because we have a national and a global responsibility to that. But also, since I've been in this job, I have been incredibly inspired and enthused by the opportunities for new jobs and growth in this sector. And that will only come if there is predictability and certainty of the way we're going to generate power in the future and deliver it to our homes and businesses. And the more you put in uncertainty into that debate, the more the price goes up. And that has an impact on the consumer as well, because the more risk there is, the more those who want to invest have to ask for their investment. And that's not good for our economy, it's not good for growth, and it's not good for the bill payers in the long run.
Are you saying that the price will go up further than it would do by introducing green energy? Because we're told that one of the reasons why the Chancellor was arguing against having a fixed target for 2030 was in order to ensure that energy prices didn't rise as sharply as they might otherwise do.
Well, I think he's mistaken on that. I mean, there are issues about the cost of infrastructure moving forward, and there's no doubt about it. Just as in today, part of our bills is about investing in that cleaner, greener and more secure future of energy that we can deliver for ourselves. But green levies on our bills represent something like 6% of the total bill. There are other factors as well, like the way in which energy is bought and sold, and Labour has been saying we've got to radically reform that to make sure it's fairer. But the truth is, and I quote Charles Hendry on this actually, Jonathan, he was the former minister. Yeah, the former energy minister only this week made a speech where he talked about how uncertainty was pushing up prices, and he gave an example of one energy investor in green energy who said that they'd seen their capital costs go up from 6% to 7%. That's a 1% rise. We need to find £100 billion to invest in that area. 1% of that is an extra £1 billion that affects us as bill payers as well. So it is absolutely important that we have certainty. And I'll give you another little nugget, Jonathan.
We'll leave it
Centrica
there.
Tonight. I heard tonight that Centrica were deciding to pull back from renewables, and that may mean they're going for gas. And if you think the long-term future is gas, you're mistaken.
Lib Dems have put a brave face on it. In fact, you've lost out, haven't you? Because you were very committed to that intermediate target of a 2030 carbon reduction, which is now no longer there because the Chancellor has insisted otherwise.
We want a target, there's no question about that. And I think where you have a coalition government, we need to treat people not like idiots. You've got two very different political parties. We are clearly far more committed to renewable energy targets like the 2030 target. We will make that clear at the next election. And one of the things you've seen as a result of the negotiations this week is the more powerful the Liberal Democrats are in a parliament, the more voice you'll have for renewable energy. So there's no question about that. But I think
do you also agree, therefore, which is implicit in what you're saying with Caroline Flint, that gas is not the solution that the Chancellor clearly strongly believes it is?
So we've got two long-term energy futures. One is to import coal, to import gas, to import oil at increasing cost from, in some cases, some quite dodgy regimes who will jack up the price and could cut off the tap at any point. That's one future. That's not the way I think we need to go. The other future is actually a very exciting one. It makes the most of what Britain is good at. Think about the best scientists we've got in the world. For example, at Cambridge University, I've visited renewable energy scientists who are doing projects that would knock your socks off in terms of what they can do with renewable energy technology. Just off the coast of Suffolk, you've got a new offshore wind farm that could serve 500,000 homes. This isn't sort of small-scale stuff. And we talk about Britain doing more exporting, doing more manufacturing, more science, more high-tech. This is where the growth is going to come from. And that's why we have to invest. That's why the decision today, yes, we didn't get the target, but we got a go-ahead on massive investment on renewables, and that is the future.
Well, what do you make of Centrica, which Caroline Flint's just referred to withdrawing from green energy infrastructural investment? Pulling back.
I'm not sure what spin we're getting on what's just been announced, but it's quite clear.
Well, if it were the case that they're pulling back, would that be evidence for your view that you've just expressed, or evidence against it?
What's evidence in terms of the response today to what's been announced is the energy industry saying, at long last, we know where we're going. We've got the commitment. Caroline, we've got the commitment. We've got the commitment for long-term dependence on renewables, ending that cap on the amount of money that can be spent. And that way, people are not just buying renewable energy that's good for the planet, but generating British jobs and British exports. And that's what we should be doing.
Steve, what is going to be different? What is going to be different between discussing this issue now and pushing it out to 2016? I mean, you know, we're talking about a few years here, but actually a few years, which means a lot in terms of people having certainty about what's going to happen. We know the Liberal Democrats support a decarbonisation target by 2030. You passed a motion at your conference. You know, what it seems to be saying is that actually, potentially, if the Conservative government get back in, they're likely to actually go away from any of the targets we've set, and they want the space to do that after a general election.
Well, that is a risk. That's a risk.
And you've signed up to that in government.
Mark Reckless.
Listening to this Labour Liberal Democrat argument, it may be that some people aren't actually aware of what's been announced today, and that is that the spending on low-carbon energy, either from government or through on top of electricity bills, is going to go up from 2.3 billion to just to 9.8 billion, more than quadruple in just 8 years. And I've been complaining about the EU budget going up, but even that's not going up by a factor of 4. And it's going to put £100 on the electricity bill for every home. It's going to hike the price of electricity for industry, much of which is going to go offshore because it can't afford to pay those electricity bills and remain competitive. What on earth's wrong with having gas? We've all this gas that could be, as the US through fracking has got all this gas, has driven prices much lower. We can get gas that comes in by ship that is frozen from a whole range of different suppliers rather than being dependent on one pipeline. And surely one of the things we have to consider is cost to try and hold down electricity bills for the public. And I thought that was what the Chancellor was pushing for, the cost of living, trying to make that better.
When you say if we depend on gas, our bills will go down, I don't know about anybody else in this room. I hadn't noticed gas bills going down lately.
Gas is a far cheaper way of making electricity than wind or solar or nuclear. And what I think suggested is that we enter into some contract with the French state electricity supplier to promise them to pay them twice the wholesale current cost of electricity in order to build these nuclear plants. I just think that's wrong.
Mark, we know that we have gas in our supply, and we know gas is going to be with us for some time, but I think there's a difference between whether you see gas as a transition to a cleaner and greener and actually a more secure future, or whether you're going to say we're going to tilt it now, invest in new gas-fired power stations, which ultimately aren't going to deliver the reductions we need in our emissions. And if we don't reduce those emissions, we will not only not meet our targets, but actually we'll tie ourselves into a type of fuel which will not therefore allow the investment to go into some of these other areas, which in the long run are going to be much cheaper, much cleaner, and actually much more secure than gas could ever be.
Caroline, when you say... Caroline, when you say tilt the market, what you mean is add £100 to every household's electricity bill.
Mark, if you want to talk about sorting out the market, then it would be great, actually, if your party would get behind some real reform of the energy market, because last week we heard about wholesale prices being rigged, and we've urged that actually we need to get on top of that. There are lots of things that affect the price. I don't think actually top of my list is an investment in a cleaner, cheaper future is the priority.
The number one thing that is affecting the price is forcing a number of big coal-fired power stations across the country under the European Union directive on large combustion plants, even though they're producing perfectly good electricity, in most cases very cheaply, are being forced to shut down. And that is driving up the price for every consumer in this country.
Rosie Harper.
I think this whole conversation is extremely worrying. I'm worried because even though people are saying long term, they're meaning short term or medium term. £100 or 120, I read this morning, on an average bill by 2020 is a very small price to pay. What we're really looking at in the long term, and I've got a grandchild due to be born in about 2 weeks' time, and what we're looking at in the long term isn't just what sort of fuel, but no fuel at all, or not enough fuel to go round. And so we absolutely have to invest in research and development now, even if it costs twice as much as that, not because we're playing economics, but because we're playing survival. Add into that what's going on in the world. I do a lot of work in India at the moment. There's a burgeoning middle class, and they've got huge and growing demands for energy themselves, and we have got one heck of a big problem to tackle. So talking about tweaking it by £1 or £2 this way or that is not really the question we should be addressing at all. We should be looking at our grandchildren's generation and ensuring fuel security for them, and it's going to have to be very radically different from the stuff that we're using at the moment.
Mark Reckless, can I just pick up with you something which I think you said, that the spend on renewable, on green energy, was going up from 2.3 billion to 9.8 billion in 8 years, which was a very large sum of money, and that itself was going to drive companies offshore. You seem to be saying that this Chancellor of the Exchequer, your Chancellor of the Exchequer, is directly introducing policies now which are going to do big damage to British industry.
Well, I think everyone knows there's been an argument going on between the Conservatives and particularly the Chancellor, who wants to hold down the cost of living, who knows that the single biggest thing for MPs in our postbag and talking to constituents is inflation and the price of everyday living going up, of which fuel and electricity bills are.
But to this extent, he's lost
part.
it, is what you're saying. You just said it, I got you clearly. You said what he is now doing is going to drive industry offshore.
As a Conservative MP, I was shocked to see this morning that this budget was going to quadruple over just 8 years, and there's huge spending and imposition of extra cost on electricity bills. I was absolutely shocked by it. I just don't think it's the right thing to do.
Because you think it will drive industry abroad?
Well, I mean, number one, because of my constituents who will be paying another £100 on their electricity bill, but also because, I don't know whether the Tata Steel thing today, whether this is a factor or in any other recent announcements, but certainly if you're paying much more for electricity in this country than in our competitors, then industry is going to be more attracted to be elsewhere rather than in the UK.
Steve Webb.
No, I think Rosie is absolutely right to bring us back to the long-term nature of all of this. I mean, these are profound long-term changes, and Mark cavils at a relatively modest increase in renewable investment, which is just the start of a long-term change. But I was just puzzled by what Caroline said, because she's basically said the energy market's a mess, it really needs sorting out. But I seem to recall the chap in charge of energy till 2010 was one Mr. E. Miliband.
Well, let me.
We're not going to go backwards. I'm sorry. We're going to go to our questioner, Peter Thomas. Your own thoughts.
Listening to the arguments, they're also old and hackneyed. They're almost as old and hackneyed as the technologies being used to generate electricity these days. Gas and nuclear are old technology. Wind requires huge infrastructure to get the power from where you generate it, to avoid upsetting the NIMBYs, to where you need to use it. There isn't very much concentration on the alternative routes of generating electricity locally to where you need to generate it.
Well, then, as you're the master of the solution, what is the you haven't got long, but what is the one thing that you would focus on?
2% government guaranteed 2% loans to end up with 200,000 homes with 1 kilowatt solar panels on the roof per year for the next 10 years. That would actually put in 6 gas-fired power stations.
Maybe they'll put that in their thinking cap. Thank you. The number 03700 100 444 for any answers. We'll go to our next.
Siobhan Moore. Do all prisoners deserve a vote?
Do all prisoners deserve a vote? It's been put. There was a point at which the government was going to have to make a decision. It's going to introduce a bill to give options for members of Parliament, which range from the answer "no, none do," which has grave ramifications in relationship to the European Court of Justice, or some prisoners might have, or a lot might have. Do all prisoners deserve a vote, Rosie Harper?
This is a very interesting question. I think it depends what you mean by the word deserve. Is a vote something that you earn, or is it an inherent right, or your birthright to have a vote? If you think about when the EU laws were being formed, it was at a time when there were still totalitarian states in Europe. And the reason for allowing prisoners a vote was that because the prisons were full of lots of people who were prisoners of conscience. And if they no longer had a vote, they wouldn't be able to vote to overturn some of the laws that put them in prison in the first place, often unfairly. So you can see you can understand the reasoning behind having the right to have a vote as a prisoner. So really this challenges our understanding of what it is to be a democracy. Personally, I think that every single person who is a British citizen in this country has the absolute inalienable right to have a vote. Because think of all the other things that we do wrong. They may have done something wrong and be in prison. Those are just the people that get caught. They happen to do things which are measurable. What about people who are outrageously proud, or people who get away for years and years and years fiddling their tax returns, or people who are brutally cruel to their partners and yet never actually get taken up for it? We are all guilty of something. Prisoners are guilty of something they get put into jail for. But I think every single person has as their birthright the right to vote and express something about this country.
Caroline Flint.
Well, I'm going to disagree with Rosie on this one. Of course, you can look at all sorts of reasons why people maybe shouldn't be allowed to vote, but I think, where people are given a custodial sentence, there is a threshold at which they have broken the rules, and I think that does mean that they forfeit the right to vote in those circumstances. And that's what we felt when we were in government. It's why we opposed the ruling at the time from the European Court of Human Rights, and why we appealed against it. I just think there are some things in society that actually you should be denied if you have committed certain crimes, and certainly if it came to serious and violent offenders, I think that would be just the wrong answer. And I think there's plenty of other things we could be doing with the prison population in terms of rehabilitation. I don't think this is top of my list.
Just on this particular thing then, are you saying that no prisoners, apart from remand prisoners, conceivably, no convicted prisoner who's serving...
My feeling at the moment is no convicted prisoner who's serving should get the vote. And if as a consequence... Sorry, because you made why you believe that very clear. If as a consequence of that, this country were to flout the directive from the European Court of Human Rights, you would endorse that too? Well, I don't think it's about flouting the court. I think it's about demonstrating that as a country we have gone through the process through Parliament of looking at these issues, and that's why I think the bill was suggested last week. The truth is that within all these debates there is some option for us to put an alternative case to show that we have looked at this as a country. What we have asked for the Labour Party to help inform the debate is that we've asked the Attorney General if they would publish the legal advice that they've had on this matter, so we can better clearly see what options we've got. But
the Attorney General's already made it very clear that it would be a very serious move indeed to ignore the ruling.
No, I understand that, and I do understand the importance of the European Court. It's something which was a UK export, and British lawyers wrote, and we have something like 47 countries part of it. But I still think within that, going back to what Rosie said before, the time at which some of these things were discussed and underpinning was about prisoners of conscience. I don't think that necessarily applies to people who have committed murder, rape and other serious crimes. That's not about prisoner of conscience. That's something completely different.
Steve Webb.
Just to be clear, nobody is suggesting that murderers would get the vote. That's not what's suggested. And coming to the question, I entirely agree. This isn't about whether you deserve a right. A right isn't something that you earn or that you deserve. And something I feel very strongly is that the phrase human rights has become somehow a boo word in the right-wing press. And how have we let that happen? Because the European Convention on Human Rights is not some evil EU plot foisted on Britain against our will. It started over 50 years ago. We were the first people to sign up at the start of the 50s because we believed following the war people deserved basic human rights. We opted in. We chose to. Nobody forced us to. And sometimes that means giving rights to people we don't much
So
like.
in this case, sorry to hurry you along, but when we're close to the end, what is your view of what position should be taken by the government in this case?
My view is that some prisoners should be able to vote because it's part of a basic civil right. What the Liberal Democrats have argued is that when a judge passes a sentence, part of the sentence should be a judgment as to whether they have stepped so far outside society, as in the case of murderers and other people who've done very serious crimes, that they have lost that right. But we should take those rights much more seriously.
Mark Reckless.
I think we've got the right balance with the policy at the moment. If you're a convicted prisoner, you don't have the vote. You've lost your liberty, and that includes the liberty to vote. But those who are on remand or on a suspended sentence, or even one of the more severe of the community sentences, that they do have the vote. I think that balance, like Caroline, I think is about right. But what I feel really strongly about on this, and what it says about our democracy, is ultimately this is a matter for Parliament to decide. And it is quite wrong, these judges, many of which don't come from what we would recognise as strong democracies, but also many of which haven't even been judges in their own countries, some of which don't even have legal training, pronouncing on what our laws should be. That should be a matter for Parliament.
Just very briefly, as has already been indicated, we half created that court, the British did. It is an international court. It has rules, and if you just say, well, we don't like these rules, so we ignore it, does that not send a rather curious message to authoritarian countries who'd be only too glad to flout
what's
those
changed,
rules?
I think, very significantly since what you referred to, Jonathan, is that Caroline's government actually brought this in and incorporated it into our domestic law under the Human Rights Act. What we now get is the worst of both worlds, where someone like Abu Qatada we can't send home, even though, under the Human Rights Act passed by our own Parliament, our own highest court says he can be sent back to Jordan. Yet, because this European court says he can't, interpreting the same thing, we're somehow preferring that interpretation. I just think that's wrong, and Parliament and our court should decide.
I'm sorry, we have to stop there. Next week, Vince Cable and Douglas Alexander, amongst others, from here in the Samuel Ward Academy in Haverhill or Haverhill. Goodbye.
The chairman was Jonathan Dimbleby and the producer was Lisa Jenkinson. And as Jonathan said, there's a chance to put forward your views on the subjects discussed in the programme by ringing any answers now on 03700 100 444. That's 03700 100 444. Any answers in a couple of minutes.